To the webinar, Legal Services at Stand Down. Thanks for being here. My name is Maddie Goldstein. I'm a program assistant at the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans, and together with our partners from Advocates for Human Potential, we make up the National Veterans Technical Assistance Center, or NVTAC. Today's webinar is especially sponsored by the ABA's Commission on Homelessness and Poverty, and information about their technical assistance program will be shared during the presentation. Before we get underway with the webinar, I'd like to go over a few logistics. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for you to access about 24 hours after it's over. You can communicate with me if you are having technical difficulties through the chat box on the GoToWebinar panel or through my email. It was on all of the webinar registration pages. All participant lines are muted, so you'll be unable to ask questions over the phone. We will leave time at the end for Q&A, and questions can be submitted again on the GoToWebinar panel. There are 2 surveys accessible there to download that will also be sent out in the follow-up email. After the webinar, you will receive a post-webinar survey, and we'd appreciate it if you took just a minute to complete it so we can continue to bring you voices and information relevant to your work with veterans. I'm so pleased to introduce today's guests. We have Sarah Samarstrom, who serves as a Vet Law Director for the Minnesota Assistance Council for Veterans, working with attorneys and non-lawyers across the state of Minnesota to remove and reduce legal barriers to stability for veterans experiencing homelessness and other life crises. And we also have Steve Binder, who is calling remotely from Arkansas today, is a Deputy Public Defender with the San Diego office of the Primary Public Defender, where he has practiced since 1988. He co-founded the Handball Court program in 1989 at Stand Down in the Veterans Treatment Court in 2011. You can find their full bios with the webinar information after. So with all of that, I am going to turn it over to our great presenters to begin today's program. Sarah and Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate everyone joining us on this webinar. I realize you're all very busy and probably have crushing caseloads and limited time as it is, but really value your participation and your work at hand. I'm here to really go through the evolution of the homeless court at Stand Down and how collaborative justice problem-solving courts have evolved over the years, but is always kind of heartwarming and critical to point out our origins at Stand Down, in large part because the only reason we started court at Stand Down is because our homeless veterans asked for it. At the very end of the first Stand Down in 1988, the VA did an exit survey. When that survey collected a lot of demographic information, it found out what branch of the military people served in, how long they'd been on the streets, their age, their level of education, employment. It was 7-8 pages of demographic information, and the very last question on that last page was, what's your greatest need? And of the 500 participants that filled out that survey, 116, 1 in 5 homeless veterans said they needed help with outstanding warrants. That was more than double the request for any other services listed. We took that statistic to the presiding judge, explained what Stand Down was all about, the services that were on site, and the needs of these homeless veterans. And the presiding judge very politely heard us out, turned around and said, we're open 5 days a week, 8 hours a day. Tell them to come on in. We'll take care of them. And we very politely turned to the judge. This is the civil attorneys. These are the host of Stand Down, Robert Van Kuren and John Nashison, the founders, other veterans organizations. And we politely told the judge, nothing personal, Your Honor. They don't trust the courts. They know when they walk into court, they are then hit with fines and threatened with custody that further frustrates their ability to reclaim their lives and to move forward, that in many respects it pushes them further outside of our community and isolates them. We convinced the court in short order that court needed to go and hold proceedings on site at San Diego High School's athletic field. And that it wasn't enough just to lift a traditional court and appear asking for convictions and punishing people with fines and custody, but that we had to reformulate the criminal justice system utilizing the trust, the good faith, the efforts that were being accomplished at stand down in order to build a stronger individual, shall we say, our homeless participants, and to promote public safety. In other words, public safety was built one individual at a time through individual safety of our homeless veterans. And in short order, we met with our prosecutor and we reviewed the full range of misdemeanor offenses that we expected to be on site. Our court clerk, the lead administrator, assured the judge that they could track cases on site outside of the courthouse with fold-out tables and chairs without the creature comforts of the courthouse, the big plexiglass windows, the big counters, all their other equipment. And mind you, this was in the day before computers hit our desk. Track all those cases, bring them back to the courthouse, and process them appropriately. And while it had never been done before in 1989, the court clerks pulled off a remarkable feat. The prosecution helped to build a response that acknowledged the vast majority of the criminal cases our homeless veterans received were in large part a result of their homeless condition, having faced citations, police contacts for drinking in public or peeing in public, because what goes in must come out, for illegal lodging, simply sleeping outside, having no other place to go, and other such things as molesting a trash can. Molesting a trash can was actually reaching inside of a trash can for either recyclables or food, because the things that we do in the privacy of our homes, eating, sleeping, restroom, what have you, our homeless veterans by nature had to do outside, totally exposed. But the prosecution in the court also recognized that while not every case is firmly ensconced in the conditions of homelessness, that other charges, more serious charges, may be related to an individual's homeless condition, or just as important, may be an obstacle to their ability to reintegrate into our community. And so we dealt and still deal with a full range of misdemeanor offenses that include theft under the influence, even battery and resisting arrest, and driving under the influence cases, in large part recognizing that these behaviors, these impediments need to be addressed, and the power of stand-down events, receiving services, and addressing, shall we say, the demons, the shortcomings, the challenges of life are just as critical in a treatment setting as they are in a traditional criminal justice setting. And so we built a structure that prepared our homeless veterans for their court appearance. And while we started with criminal justice proceedings, counseling people in the back half of the mental health tent at the very first stand down, we actually held a court session on handball courts at the first stand down underneath camo netting with fold-out tables. And while I can't tell you the specifics of the first individual, what cases they presented, what proof of accomplishments that individual showed the court, I can tell you that when that individual stood before the court, received the court order, and walked away, that there was an audible gasp, not just from the other homeless participants, but from the host of Stand Down and the others attending, watching the proceedings for the first time. In large part, that gasp was the realization and the relief that the paddy wagons didn't show up. The police didn't come and set this up as a sting operation, but that it was real and that this was an opportunity. Mind you, a small window of opportunity that our 3-day Stand Down presents, but a meaningful window of opportunity where we as, shall we say, courts, officialdom, were in many respects acknowledging their plight, acknowledging their efforts, however big or small, to reclaim their lives, and taking them seriously for having not just appeared in court, but voluntarily walking on site at Stand Down and engaging in services. And that signal was powerful enough that when the handful of veterans started walking back into the community from that first Stand Down hearing in 1989, that the floodgates opened and the veterans who were out in the community just kind of like biding their time started approaching us to have their cases resolved too. And so the little spark that started in 1989, you could even say, in 89 was the same year drug court started in Florida, that the homeless court at Stand Down was the first court in the nation exclusively dedicated to helping veterans with their criminal matters. But we also realized at that point it wasn't enough just to help with criminal matters. Over the years, it has grown to help veterans with child support matters, other civil and administrative legal matters too. But we're going to save some of that for later on in the presentation. In large part, as we get to what is Stand Down, you can see San Diego's horseshoe of tents for what originally was 500 to 600 homeless veterans back in 89 and the early 90s to what is sadly currently 1,000 homeless veterans, in large part because our tents are bigger, given the, shall we say, achievements or the modification of tents for Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as, sadly, the continued dire circumstances we face across this nation in building enough services to meet the plight of our homeless citizens. But that said, I don't want to get too dire on everybody, I can say even in San Diego, while we haven't reached the goal of 0 homeless veterans, the advent of VASH vouchers has made a significant dent in the number of homeless veterans we have on our streets in San Diego. More on that later on too. But San Diego's Stand Down started in 1988. In large part, it is born of our Vietnam veterans who, when a group of them came home in San Diego, they were pissed. That's a legal term, by the way. They literally wanted to take action on the VA. In part a political statement, in part a sincere dissatisfaction for the way they were treated, not just in service, but on their return back stateside. They knew, even though we didn't at that point have a definition of post-traumatic stress, they knew something wasn't right. They knew they were being treated badly, and they knew they deserved better. And while they wanted to take action, there was a chaplain from Vietnam who gathered them around, individually asking them, hey, I have a veteran in need, will you help? And as is wont in the military, that we have your back culture, we are mission driven, we're working together. These veterans, however much angst and anger they had, they stepped up and said yes. And when they all met in a circle, they're all looking around, they're all wondering which veteran it is that needs help. And this chaplain leads them through a discussion acknowledging that they had every right to be upset and feel as they did. but redirected their anger and their energy, challenging them to actually build something constructive. And essentially, this chaplain was part of building the vet centers. These veterans were responsible for building Veterans Village of San Diego, for building the stand-down events, and they're the same veterans, shall we say, who've built Swords to Plowshares and many of the programs in your communities. I'd like to say that our Vietnam veterans came back, shall we say, rough around the edges, kind of a euphemistic. They had their challenges. But now that today they are our leaders in the community, having shown us that you can make it through these rough times. And we need to be mindful of that for those who are still on the streets. But they were also instructive in our building a homeless court, both at stand down and the monthly courts and the veterans courts that were to come, in that it isn't enough to simply put somebody in front of a court, talk about a particular charge and say guilty or not guilty, as though a conviction supposedly defines the problem, and then you put the individual in front of the court and you mete out some punishment that the traditional court usually says fines, custody, something to supposedly gain their attention, make them responsible, and teach them never to do this again. The traditional court means simply weren't addressing the problem. The opportunities, the treatment, the engagement and building of community at stand down really changed that dynamic to reach into these veterans, meet them where they were, and afford, shall we say, a stronger measure of justice and public safety. So as you look at that stand down photograph, and you see the camo netting on the bottom right corner, those are the handball courts that we inhabit for legal proceedings. And yes, justice can be done on a handball court. We turn to the next slide on stand-down classifications. I won't read it all to you so much as to say that there is a wide variety of approaches to building a stand-down across the nation. And in large part, we could all turn and just say we are working with our own capacity, striving to make do with what we have. And while we feel overwhelmed, the admirable part of the people I meet and the people who are working so hard in the community is you continue to strive for perfection, knowing there's more to be done, that there is never enough, but that as we continue working, yes, even knocking our heads up against the wall, we are a modeling in many respects for our homeless participants, saying you may not have enough, you deserve better, but you work with what you have and you keep going. What do you make of this opportunity? Because the other part we learned at through our instruction of our founders at Stand Down was our veterans come in, they are sometimes just really obstinate, angry. They walk on site voluntarily, but they're like trying to process this tremendous change from the streets to a welcoming community. And one of the things that these homeless veterans focus on and they process is, the VA did me wrong, the police did me wrong, my public defender did me wrong. And one of the things the tent leaders have to learn to respond is, it may all be true. We're not arguing that point. But what are you going to do now with the opportunities, the time that is present right here at this 3-day stand-down? And for some communities, it may be a 1 or 2-day stand-down or a partial day. Not everybody will have a full range of services. Not everyone will be sheltered on site. But with whatever services are there, how do we access them and how do we maybe push, however gently or firmly, for more so that we can really address the pressing needs our homeless veterans have and our communities deserve in order to overcome the scourge that homelessness represents. And so hats off to you all for, as they used to say, doing more with less, or the frustrations you might be facing in your daily lives. But it is one of the things, not having served in the military myself, I've learned to admire and wish we in the civilian world had a stronger part of we've got your back, the military culture of working together. And it's in part why the instruction of stand down, breaking down isolation, building connections, and engaging in services is so valuable to our day in, day out work now. And so breaking down those barriers is critical for the court. And now that I turn to the courts, you'll see the San Diego homeless court model. There's 3 paragraphs that I won't read to you. I'll leave that for you later. So much as to say our core principles are that our participants enter the homeless court at stand down voluntarily, that a plea bargain agreement generally agrees to dismissal of 90% of the cases, not because it's an amnesty, as most are apt to say, but because it's an acknowledgement that they wouldn't be committing these offenses but for the circumstances of their homelessness or the trauma of their military service. But more important than that, we quickly turn the conversation from the criminal justice aspect of what's presented in court to tying that in with them accessing services on site. And while we counsel participants all day Friday at the San Diego stand down, and we prepare them for the Saturday court hearing, we work purposefully to tie them into these services, actually having staff who walk and introduce our participants to the services of their choice, essentially telling them, asking them, what's your greatest need on the streets to overcome homelessness? What is it you need to build on the stand-down event? And we'll walk them to the Department of Social Services, to the VA, to the medical tent where they're pulling teeth, where eyeglasses, footwork, podiatrists are. We will walk them to the AA, post-traumatic stress, any counseling sessions that are going on. And the scores of the homeless service agencies that are on site for a warm handoff, an introduction, and an explanation of what's going on. But that the individual's participation in those services, as with the court session, is voluntary, but that it is critical for that individual to move on in life. And so resolving these cases isn't just removing an obstacle from the individual's life or their burdens. It's actually helping the court and the community at large by presenting them an individual who's more engaged and more fully prepared to participate in our communities, not just living on the streets. And that's part of why the sentence, the services our clients present, actually written out on the back of their application card, presented to the court, shows they've done something tangible to resolve these cases, something that's going to move their life forward. Again, no matter how big or small. So you turn and you see there's a child support at court now, as well as the San Diego model. And what that means is we're trying to help our homeless veterans, shall we say, come clean and participate in the community as fully as possible, removing other obstacles. And while we have public defenders on site, our Navy JAGs, and our Marine Corps legal personnel come to help also, because candidly, not everyone trusts their public defender. Go figure. But they can also relate to the our JAGs and our Marines can relate to the military aspects of the individual, and it shows the broader concerns of the community for our homeless veterans in welcoming them back. And that's in part why the Department of Child Services has essentially stepped up, and they too now hold court proceedings on site at stand down. So Friday, the San Diego criminal court we counsel participants all day in preparation for the Saturday court hearing, and Friday is when Department of Child Support Services actually holds proceedings on the same court that we will then occupy on Saturday. I invite you all, as you turn to the San Diego stand down court training, to San Diego, July 21 through the 22nd, to our stand down, where you can come observe us in action, meet our collaborative justice partners, the prosecution, the court clerks, the judge, service providers, stand down hosts, and our participants, and actually learn some best steps or some practices, see if what we say actually happens, so you can take this back to your community. And I venture to say also, wherever you start in your outreach in developing a stand down, a court at stand down, you would be further ahead than when we started in 1989. We have materials and other technical assistance we could provide you individually. If you want to contact Madison at NCHV or the ABA directly, or even myself, we'd be happy to follow up with you. And from that, I turn it over to Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. For those of you who are following along on the webinar, you may have noticed that Steve is not on a computer right now, and has a slightly older version of the slides, and so sorry for all of our back and forth on that. Steve, great job talking through it. So I'm going to talk not just about the Minnesota model, but also just a little bit about the Child Support Court at stand down. As was mentioned in the introductions, I'm the Vet Law Director for the Minnesota Assistance Council for Veterans, and we run 9 or 10 stand-down events per year. We have a large stand-down event in Minneapolis, and then much smaller events are held in other communities around the state. We are not able to do a child support court at our stand-down, although I would love to see us do it. The main difference between how stand-downs are run in Minnesota and how they're run in San Diego is the pre-registration. And by pre-registering the homeless veterans who attend stand-down in San Diego, they are able to do a lot of pre-event work, both in screening for criminal court issues, but also in screening for child support issues. And so the Child Support Court at stand down runs the list of stand down participants through the child support system to identify veterans who owe child support to the county. When you have a child support order, you can owe money to the other parent, the custodial parent, but you also may owe money directly to the child support office or the county who's administering the child support order if the custodial parent had been on public assistance. And so what they're able to do at the Child Support Court at stand down is screen for those veterans who owe money to the county, because the county can help resolve those arrears. Arrears is just the legal term for past due child support. And so they run them through the system. They can do reviews and adjustments, arrears management, so coming up with payment plans that veterans, the homeless veterans, can be compliant with, and also restore driver's licenses. On the challenge report, child support is always one of the largest unmet needs, and right up there with it is usually restoration of driver's licenses. Now, driver's licenses can also be taken for other issues related to driving infractions and criminal offenses, but non-payment of child support, or rather non-compliance with child support orders, is also one of the really common reasons someone would have a restricted driver's license. So child support notifies the veteran, and as part of the agreement with Veterans Village of San Diego in the stand-down event, they agreed not to issue any orders or pursue any enforcement action that would alienate the veteran. As Steve talked about when he was talking about stand-down events generally, it really is about building community and it would destroy that sense of community pretty quickly if people were coming out of the court component, whether it's criminal or child support court, with a negative response and a negative feedback on what happened to them during that process. I don't have the exact numbers for the most recent events at San Diego Stand Down for the child support court, but anecdotally they have resolved millions of dollars in unpaid child support. And this is a benefit obviously to the veteran, but also to the child support office. Some child support offices get ranked or get sort of judged based on how much they collect of their outstanding orders. And if somebody's got a child support arrear level of, you know, $100,000 for a child who's in their 40s, you know, child support knows they're not going to get that money from somebody who is living off of the VA pension. And so it's in their benefit, it's to their benefit as well to reduce that award to a level that's something that they can actually get payments on. So in addition to reducing child support orders for homeless veterans, they've also noticed an uptick in payments. So the veterans who've been processed through the child support court at Stand Down in San Diego have actually increased their likelihood of making payments on their cases because they recognize those payments are fair and based on their actual ability to pay. But like I said, you really have to have foresight and knowledge of who's going to be there to be able to set up something like the child support court. So at Minnesota Stand Downs, we have a court component and a civil legal services section where we can provide advice to folks, and I'll talk about non-court components a little bit later. Our stand down court model is pretty much largely stolen from Steve's stand down court model. I was lucky to go out to the training a few years ago and see it in person. It really made a huge difference in how we run our events. One of the things we do that's a little bit different in Minnesota is that we get a statewide jurisdictional order from our state Supreme Court, and that allows any judge at the stand down event or volunteering to help at the stand down event to resolve issues anywhere in Minnesota. So we were lucky enough to partner with a Court of Appeals judge who has a son in the Navy and a lot of veteran family members, and she's been willing to go to our Supreme Court and request the order for us. And that really has helped us, particularly in rural areas, remove some of the barriers for veterans who may not have access to transportation. They may have a legal issue or a fine or a warrant in a county that's 2 to 6 hours away from where they live, and are told when they try to get help that they have to go to the courthouse where the warrant is. So that's been a huge benefit, especially at our more rural events, to be able to have those judges on site address issues anywhere in the state of Minnesota. The judges are not limited to criminal matters. Once again, we don't do any pre-screening at our stand-down events, so we really just create a court team that can be responsive to whatever walks through the door. So while the vast majority of the things we resolve at our stand-down courts are unpaid fines and fees and misdemeanor warrants, we also have the judges there, and they're willing to sign fee waiver forms for somebody who's trying to bring a divorce action. Alternate service orders. So if somebody wants to get divorced from a spouse that they haven't seen in 10 years, they may not know where to find that person. And it takes court intervention and permission to use alternate service methods, and that can be a huge benefit. Much like San Diego, instead of sort of traditional community service, which is how we had started doing this, it was sort of like a line of ducklings walking after our program director as he was closing up the event, trying to find projects for them to do to fulfill their community service. Instead, now we have the defense attorney meets with the veteran after they go through our initial screening process, and after identifying the cases that can be resolved by the court, they sit down and they talk about what other services the veteran may benefit from, whether that's employment services, housing assistance, mental health assistance, being connected with a social worker at the VA. Those are some of the common examples. And they have a half sheet of paper, and they just need to go downstairs to the main stand-down event and sign up for appointments with those service providers. And simply by making the appointment and agreeing to follow up with it, that's counted as their community service. The benefit to the court component is that we're able to close out the case on site. We have court administration on site. We have prosecutors and defense attorneys and judges on site at our largest stand-down event. And by reducing the amount of follow-up and communication with the court, we find that it's a higher rate of success in terms of making sure that these issues are actually resolved and that resolution is entered into the court record. The Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, are in 2 different counties, and so we have the city attorneys who deal with everything less than a felony level offense. The city attorneys from Minneapolis and St. Paul are present, as well as the county attorneys from Hennepin County, which is where Minneapolis is, and Ramsey County, which is where St. Paul is located. And then we found we were serving a lot of veterans who came in from suburban counties or other parts of the state. And so we've been able to send out a notice through the city and county attorney programs to all prosecutors in the state so they're aware that this is going on. The suburban prosecutors tend to pick 1 or 2 prosecutors to represent their interests, and so those individuals are on site. If we have to resolve a warrant or an outstanding issue somewhere else in the state, the prosecutor will, or the defense attorney will call that prosecutor and get permission to resolve it on site at stand down. So it does take some coordination, and it takes some notice and making sure that folks know what you're doing. It's always awkward to sort of introduce the concept to them while you're trying to get them to agree to something. As I said earlier, probably the most common thing that we do is dealing with unpaid fines and fees from past interaction with the criminal justice system. Probably the single most common issue is driving after revocation and dealing with those unpaid fines and fees that create a cycle of keeping somebody without having a driver's license and access to transportation. But they also deal with, we had one veteran who actually had a court date in northern Minnesota, and instead of going to court, he decided to come to stand down. So by the time he got to our court, there was a warrant for his arrest for failure to appear, and the judges of stand down called up to the court in St. Cloud and were able to get permission to resolve it at stand down. It's not the kind of case we typically see, but the judges have been really flexible and really positive about doing whatever they can do to help the veterans at our event. As I mentioned earlier, we have another 8 or 9 events a year, depending on the year, that are in smaller areas. So our metro event sees a little over 1,000 veterans between 2 days. If you think back to the slide that talks about NCHB classifications, we actually don't meet the official classification for a stand down for a couple of reasons. We don't have on-site housing at our events. Only our metro event is 2 days. Every other event we host is just a 1-day event. And they're also all open to any veteran. There are some services that are restricted to homeless veterans, but any veteran can attend the event, join us for lunch, talk to the service providers, and connect with their peers. There's a couple of reasons for that. Minnesota, certainly compared to San Diego, has a much smaller veteran population. And we want to make sure that the veterans who may not self-identify as homeless are still getting access to these services so that if they know someone who's struggling, or if they perhaps struggle in the future, they're going to know who to turn to. So our rural events are very similar to our larger stand-down events. They're just scaled down to a level where we're not using more resources than we need to address these issues. And so the court staff mainly participates remotely at the rural events. So we still have a judge, we still have a statewide jurisdictional order, but the judge stays at the courthouse. In a lot of the smaller events, we may see 400 or 500 people, 400 people total at the event, and maybe a dozen to 30 will come to the legal section. Versus the metro event, which sees over 1,000 and has 300 attend the legal section. In the smaller counties, there may only be 1 or 2 judges who sit on the bench. So rather than pulling that judge off the bench and away from their regular duties for the day, we just communicate with the court administration. So if we see a case that we think needs resolution by the judge, we'll reach out to court administration who's at the courthouse and see if that can be resolved via email. There's a surprising number of issues, particularly those related to fines or fees, don't need to require an appearance in front of the court in a technical sense. The judge has the jurisdiction and the ability to waive those fines and fees without prosecutor approval. For warrants or other outstanding issues, they do need to bring in the prosecutor. So we set aside an hour or 2 at the end of the day on the court calendar. And then at the end of our stand-down event, if we do need to have any hearings, we can take the veterans to the courthouse and hold the hearings in front of the judge there. We usually have a public defender or defense attorney on site to help us screen those cases, but the prosecutor, the court administration, and the judge are usually off-site at the courthouse. To be honest, there are very few issues that we've had to hold hearings on at our rural events. We've been doing the rural stand-downs for about 5-6 years now, and I probably name all of the cases off the top of my head. I think we've maybe had 15 or 20 that needed court involvement at those rural events. But we did have one where the veteran was in treatment at the Fargo VA hospital, and he had some fines and fees related to a drunk driving incident, which had really triggered him going into treatment. But he had been a professional driver. He was a commercial driver, and so he really needed to access his driver's license when he got done with treatment so that he'd be able to continue in his profession. And so the judge at that event was off-site, and we communicated via email and drafted a potential proposed order for the judge to sign. And the prosecutor agreed that if the veteran successfully completed the treatment program at the Fargo VA hospital, all of his fines and fees would be released. And so they weren't released that day at the stand-down event, but his VA social worker stayed in communication with the court, and once he completed the program, sent them an official notification, and the court waived his fines and fees, which then released the hold on his driver's license, so he was able to go back to work as a commercial truck driver. Of course, we love having the judges on site at our event. It really is an amazing and powerful visual to come into one of the stand-down events and see all of the veterans there. A lot of the service providers are veterans, so we do always invite them to attend, maybe join us for lunch, stop by and say hi for a few minutes if they can't get away for longer than that. It is important, I think, to introduce them to our clients and make sure that they know that whether it's, that they're seeing veterans in their courtroom, even if they may not know they're veterans. And I think it can be really powerful, particularly in smaller communities, for the judges and court staff to come into the event and just see how many veterans are in their community and how many are reaching out to access these services. As I said, the statewide jurisdictional order is still obtained. We just set it up so that it recognizes that the judge will be at the courthouse and not on site at the stand-down event. As Steve mentioned, there's technical assistance for stand-down through the American Bar Association's Commission on Homelessness and Poverty, and Steve and I are both, what are we, Steve? Lifetime members, emeritus members. We have both been associated with the Commission on Homelessness and Poverty for quite a while, and the ABA can provide on-site or remote assistance, not just in developing the court, but also in identifying local legal and court contacts, people who may be involved with the American Bar Association, or people who we can do some research and find out, are there judges on the bench who are veterans? They may be a good point to reach out to. Are there any veterans treatment courts? Are there VJOs through the VA system that know lawyers and judges in the community who may be supportive of your events? Also covering a full breadth of legal models. So, from the San Diego homeless court model down to how to connect with your local legal aid office. If you're not quite ready to build an entire court component, where is a good starting point for you and your community and what your clients need? So Amy Horton-Newell is the staff person at the ABA who serves the Commission on Homelessness and Poverty, and her email address is up here. She's also helping to coordinate the training out in San Diego. And there are materials from presentations that ABA members have done related to homeless veterans that are available online with the link provided on this slide. But really, any questions connecting to any resources or asking to get Steve out to your community to help figure out where to start in developing a stand-down homeless court, the ABA is really a great resource for all of those things. So outside of the court components, I wanted to talk just a little bit more about different types of legal services you can have at your stand-down event. Before the vet law program got going, most of our stand-down events that MACV helped coordinate did have some legal presence. It was usually a legal aid office that had a table amongst the other service providers where they would have an outreach staff person, a lawyer, perhaps a paralegal, handing out business cards and giving out legal information. And that's what I would consider program outreach and referrals. Sort of next up the list is a brief legal advice and services model, which is kind of like a legal clinic. Legal clinic is a very vague term that can mean just about anything. But the idea here is that you're providing services directly to the veteran on site. So it's more than just making a referral. It's more than just sharing information about the program. There's actually some communication between an attorney and the veteran, looking into the case, maybe doing some brief services. So is there a letter that can be drafted? The picture on this slide is actually one half of our legal section. We're in an amazing building on Fort Snelling grounds. It's a Boy Scout base camp. So you can sort of see the climbing wall in the background there. And this is our form section, obviously before anyone showed up at the event. But this is where attorneys sit and they can help people fill out legal forms. They can help them draft letters. We can do legal research for them. And this, we have a lot of attorneys who want to volunteer at this event, and they don't all have expertise in poverty law. It's a really good way for us to use those volunteers sort of under the tutelage of a more experienced attorney in that area of law. And then the court components, I think we've covered pretty well: the homeless court, the Minnesota stand-down court model, and the child support court. So as I mentioned, so if you're starting from scratch and trying to figure out where to go and what to look at, one sort of low-hanging fruit would be to look at Are there community legal programs, whether it's legal aid or a veteran-specific program through an SSVF provider or HVRP provider, who has a legal component that can be incorporated into your stand-down event? Oftentimes, our legal aid providers, identify veterans in their caseload, but in terms of connecting to legal services, stand-down is one of those unique events where, the service providers and the coordinators of stand-down are bringing together all of the clients in the first place, and that saves the legal aid partner quite a bit of work, and it can introduce them to your client base, much like building relationships with judges and courts. If you can show your legal aid partners or your legal aid providers in your community that our clients are the same people, right? Low-income individuals who are struggling with poverty law issues, whether it's family law, child support, landlord-tenant law, consumer debt issues. I mean, that's what legal aid does. And I think opening their eyes to that and seeing that veterans have legal needs outside of the VA system, it's not just benefits claims and discharge upgrades. A lot of what we do, and what I tell people when I describe the vet law program, is we don't do veterans law, we do poverty law for veterans. And because stand-down events exist in many communities and draw together this population, it's a great way to really visualize and have them really internalize the fact that we're all serving the same populations. So even if it just starts with somebody handing out cards, making that connection with them could strengthen other efforts you're making towards creating partnerships with legal providers. You can certainly do a modified version of outreach and referrals and find some, private space so they can do consultations. We do our events at all sorts of different locations. We have some events that are at National Guard armories. We have some events that are at community centers. We have one event that is in a hockey arena, and so the legal section of that event is in the hallway outside of a locker room. We fit in there. We have a smaller team. We know the space, but it gives us a little bit of privacy away from all of the other service providers so that we can have those one-on-one consultations. Like I said, if you build it, they will come. If you start small, even if it's just somebody handing out business cards for their organization, you can build on that relationship, whether you're looking to build a court or a brief services, on-site services model. Speaking of, so this would give attorneys or veterans access to one-on-one consultation with an attorney. Some brief services, how I describe it to people is our volunteer attorneys agree to help the person at the event. So there's no guarantee for ongoing legal assistance, but if there is something small we can do, if it's drafting paperwork, making a phone call, requesting documentation on behalf of a veteran, that's something that we can do in the sort of legal clinic component of our stand-down legal section. We also give brief advice on criminal law matters. So maybe somebody has a criminal law matter or a question about criminal expungement that isn't necessarily appropriate for the court team, but they can talk to an attorney outside of the court component about that issue and about their options. We also use it to screen and identify cases that we could help further with. And so whether that's assistance through one of our on-site staff attorneys or one of our community partners, helping the veteran understand their options. Sometimes people ask me why we let non-homeless veterans come to our event, and my experience over the last 6 years in this job has been that one of the big complaints or areas of confusion is people don't know how to talk about their legal issue or exactly what their legal issue is. Very few people present their legal issue as, somebody violated this statute or, this is the recourse I need. People usually present them in terms of what happened, how they feel like they were treated unfairly or what they think was done incorrectly. And so by having them sit down with an attorney, even if it results in a referral to a private attorney they're going to have to pay, just helping them understand the context of the issue and what legal recourse may be available is really valuable. And so while we can't provide representation to everybody who comes through our legal clinic at Stand Down, everybody gets a chance to talk to an attorney. Everybody gets a legal analysis of their case and help them understand what options are available. If somebody is over income for legal aid or over income for pro bono programs, they need to understand that their options are either going it alone or hiring a private attorney. And we can make referrals to private attorneys who we know practice in those areas. We have an online lawyer referral system that we can look at with them, and providing them with some next steps is helpful, even if it's not exactly the free full representation they may have wanted. One of the other things we do at a lot of our events is will drafting. Because the veteran population is aging, particularly in rural areas, we find a pretty high need for estate planning and information about basic estate planning. And so that's something that we've had a good amount of success training our volunteers on and matching them with the need in the community. So when you're starting to build a stand-down legal clinic, there are a few places to start, looking at your local legal aid programs or pro bono programs. A lot of larger law firms have pro bono coordinator positions where their entire job is managing the pro bono efforts of the firm. It's great to identify who those people are. They know the lay of the land, and they have access to a lot of volunteers and, to be honest, financial resources to support a pro bono initiative. At our legal clinic events outside of stand-downs, we do, like I said, about 9 to 10 stand-downs a year. We also do another 35 to 40 legal clinic events, and we have law firm sponsors who actually give us financial donations and send volunteers. So they're basically paying us to volunteer at our events. I don't know how that worked out so perfectly, but it did, and it's wonderful. And so there are other tools that come with law firm partnerships. We have one law firm here in the Twin Cities that not only volunteers at several of our legal clinic events and stand-downs, but they've also started a toy drive so that those veterans who are living in our residential programs who have children have gifts to share with their kids at the holidays. And so really you can start with something like a legal clinic or a stand-down event and build that into a stronger partnership with a law firm or other pro bono program. There's also local bar associations, state bar associations, county bar associations, regional bar associations that may have coordinated efforts to provide pro bono services. The Minnesota State Bar Association has a specific military and veterans affairs legal section, so that's one place to look. And then also look at your local law schools. A lot of law schools have requirements that their students volunteer. We have a couple of strong partnerships in Minnesota with law schools where we take their students with us. The picture on this slide is from what we call our pre-orientation service project. And that's a partnership with a nonprofit that runs pro bono opportunities in Minnesota for law students, where before they even go to their first day of law school, they spend a week volunteering. And so this is a group of students that we brought with us up to the Iron Range in northern Minnesota, and we have back-to-back stand-down events up there. And so they went with us to Virginia, Minnesota, and Duluth, Minnesota to participate in the stand-downs in those locations. We also pull in non-lawyers, so whether it's at a stand-down or a legal clinic, we always have child support available. We bring in someone from the child support office who can provide us with the information needed to decide legally whether or not the veteran has recourse through a modification or if there's another payment plan or something else that can be set up to help with their case. Oftentimes, homeless veterans don't have access to the original order. They don't have the information with them, which can make it difficult to provide those direct services. And we also bring in someone who works with driver's licenses. So we have somebody from our Attorney General's office who represents the Department of Public Safety and can look up driver's license statuses. But we also have hearing officers from our Department of Public Safety who can talk to veterans about their options regarding reinstating their driver's license. When the first couple of years I did stand-downs, we held them in tents, much like San Diego. We no longer hold them in tents outside, which has actually been really beneficial to the legal section. As you can imagine, having papers flying around and trying to connect to Wi-Fi and printers can be somewhat of a challenge outdoors. But we bring our own wireless with us. We have printing and scanning capabilities. And then we track and gather data to be able to show our funders and our supporters what we're able to do at the stand-down events. Certainly, I'd be happy to talk to anyone about any of those issues offline. I see we're running close on time here, so wanted to open it up to questions if anyone had them or any input Steve may have.
If I might interject just briefly, I understand that as attorneys we dress real fancy, we talk our own special language, and we have formal protocols, which can often be intimidating to others. But I encourage you as treatment providers, as people in the community, to step up as our prosecutors, our judiciary, our defense attorneys are really looking to have meaningful impact from their own perspective in their profession. And as treatment providers, as people in the community, you offer solutions to the challenges that they're facing. And I can't state that strongly enough. Just as you might feel that the ABA is a big, remote, untouchable organization, I can't say enough that it is very hands-on and responsive to helping our veterans, our homeless veterans in particular. The reality is the ABA has been working mightily, much like our VA is working mightily in other aspects. I'm sure you're working mightily to really address the pressing needs that are out there. And so what's been instructive is this solutions-driven approach is, regardless of our roles, is really critical. And we may need a push. You might need to demand certain things in the most polite of terms to make us responsive, but please call upon us for to build that response. Thank you.
Okay, so in the last 4 minutes, I will just try and take a few of the questions, but to reiterate, the slides and all the resources are going to be sent out in a follow-up email about 24 hours out, and all of the contact information is available there. So how much coordination exists between state and local courts? DLs, I'm sorry, I don't know what that stands for, can be suspended by about 10 different local courts in my county, driver's licenses. How much coordination?
Just speaking for Minnesota, which is all that I have experience with, it is very coordinated. We actually we have sort of the same court system. We don't have separate courts. We have district courts, and those serve both the localities and the state. So it is very coordinated. As much as I feel like we've made some big strides on driver's license issues, we have still fallen short of getting the Department of Public Safety to waive the reinstatement fee. So we've been limited to dealing with the fines and fees owed to the court, or dealing with outstanding driving after revocation charges that the stand-down court can deal with. But we still run into that barrier of having to pay the fee to get the license reinstated. So if anyone knows anyone high up in the Department of Public Safety here in Minnesota, please give me a call.
What types of services can active duty military JAGs provide for veterans?
They can actually come on site and help counsel participants with their legal matters. We make sure when they come to San Diego, when they join us, that there is a public defender, shall we say, paralleling, working with them, so they're not on their own. But we do really cherish and we value the input and the contribution that the active duty JAGs have.
And our active duty JAG well, we're a National Guard state, and so they're available to give brief advice on a lot of issues, but typically don't provide full representation services. We've actually partnered with them a couple of times during their 2-week training to actually come and volunteer at one of our events, which has been really great.
Last question. How would you deal with back child support if the order is from another state other than where the veteran is currently residing?
So that's one of the banes of my existence is interstate child support issues. But there's actually a network. There was a pilot project in 2011, I believe it started in 2010, to try to design models to work on interstate child support issues and child support issues for homeless veterans that grew out of the challenge report. So the basic rule is that the issue has to be dealt with in the state that originated the order. Oftentimes enforcement is transferred to another state, but the state that started the order usually holds on to modification powers, so it has to be dealt with through that state. Dealing with the arrears is going to depend on who they're owed to. So as I mentioned earlier, it can be owed to the custodial parent or to a government entity or the child support office. Only the custodial parent can waive their right to that money. The county or the child support office cannot agree to lower what's owed to the custodial parent and vice versa. So we always start with a letter to the custodial parent explaining the veteran's situation and asking if they would reduce the amount of money owed to them. Now, sometimes people agree to that. Most of the time they don't. And in some respects, it's easier to work with the county or the child support office because the person who's making that decision isn't taking money directly out of their own hands or own pockets. In some cases, if everybody involved in the order is now living in the same location, you may be able to transfer the entire order to the state where the veteran resides. But there is a rule that's part of the agreement that state child support offices agree to get federal funding that states that they have to allow a non-custodial parent to appear remotely in a modification case. So we presented actually at NCHV's conference this year on child support, and I presented with somebody from child support, and James is a great contact. There's an interstate child support person in every state and somebody who's tasked to work specifically with veterans. And so if you have questions about contacts in another state, give me a call and I will find that contact for you. And then there should be a mechanism for allowing the veteran to appear remotely by telephone so that they can request a modification. We get a lot of folks with child support cases in Texas here in Minnesota, and I struggle to always find resources for them in Texas, but have been more successful in getting telephone hearings. We had one veteran in our housing program who had a case in California, and we got him a telephone hearing, and he was able to tell his story to the judge. And even though his case was at around $70,000, I think the interest was adding up at $90 a month at that point, the judge agreed that he could have an $8 per month child support order. So he was compliant by sending in $8 per month, and it was just huge. It changed his outlook on his future, his employability, and so making sure that you understand those rules or you can connect to folks who do is really, really helpful in getting through some of those interstate child support issues.
Okay. Sarah and Steve, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to be on this webinar today. You did it in between travel and a busy month, so we really appreciate it. Everybody, thank you very much for attending and submitting your great questions. The follow-up email will be sent out in about 24 hours. You'll have these slides, so access to all that contact information, the recording, and the handouts that were available for download. And look out for our next upcoming webinar. And we hope to see you again. And excuse me, one more thing. The post-webinar survey will be popping up in just a moment as we close out. So thank you, everybody, so much for being here today. Have a great rest of your Thursday.
Thank you.
Thanks.